Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rise.
Good afternoon. I'm Bernard Greene, member of the Brookline Select Board and chair of the Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Committee. The annual MLK celebration event is intended to honor and reflect on the life and works of Martin Luther King Jr. and the global social justice issues for which he struggled and ultimately gave his life. We try to make this event more than the typical perfunctory gathering on the holiday that schools and towns across the country are offering up. This event and other events organized by the MLK Committee are designed to challenge people's thinking about pressing issues facing Brookline, America, and the world, including race and racism, but also poverty, war, nativism, and the attacks on democracy worldwide that are restricting the ability of people to speak out against injustice. I'm speaking in front of a virtual image of the beautiful main auditorium of the Coolidge Corner Theater here in Brookline. This year's program, like last year's, is entirely virtual because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the recent snowballing spread of the Omicron variant. But I want to recognize the Coolidge Corner Theater for the many years it has been the home of this event and thank them for their support. This year's program will be filled with poetry and song germane to King's human rights work, including by literary performer, author, and poet Reggie Gibson, the Brookline Poet Laureate Jennifer Barber, and students from Brookline's Remote Learning Academy. We are excited and honored to have as our keynote speaker, Boston University law professor Robert Sy, speaking on the topic, Our Voting Rights, the Struggle Continues. Following Professor Sy, we are also honored to have our U.S. representative, Jake Auchinclose, give us an update on the struggle to protect our precious voting rights in Congress. We hope that this afternoon's program will give you a deeper understanding of the continuing struggle for voting rights. We lost many giants of the global human rights struggle in 2021. The legacy of their accomplishments have not died, but will remain to guide and inform our generation and future generations. On December 26, human rights giant Desmond Tutu died at age 90. Tutu was a central figure in the struggle in South Africa against apartheid, and along with Nelson Mandela and Mandela's comrades in the African National Congress, both Black and white, and their allies, made the transition from apartheid to a not perfect, but evolving democracy, possible without bloodshed. Also lost in 2021 were the following: Meredith Adding Jr., a member of the Tougaloo Nine, arrested for entering a whites-only library in 1961 at 79 years of age. Robert Moses, a young math teacher in Harlem who went to Mississippi with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960 to work alongside of and learn from local residents to register people to vote, and who, as a MacArthur Foundation Fellow, launched the Algebra Project, which uses math as an organizing tool for education equity initiatives at 86 years of age. Gloria Richardson, a pioneering civil rights activist and labor organizer in Cambridge, Maryland, at 99 years of age. Alvin Sykes, a self-taught legal defender and civil rights activist who helped reopen the investigation of the 1955 lynching of Emmett Till at 64 years of age. Martha White, who refused to give up her seat on a bus in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1953 and helped launch a mass bus boycott that was the template for the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 at 99 years of age. Desmond Tutu and many of the other giants I have listed lived long lives despite the physical and psychological injuries many of them suffered in their fights for justice. Andrew Young, while recounting his memories of John Lewis and the other human rights giants who died in 2020, noted that many activists live long lives despite their injuries. He attributed this to the fact that they never allowed anger and hatred to invade their souls. They met hate with love, and they met anger with calm defiance. Let us remember Andrew Young's observation as we live our lives today in Brookline. To start our program, first, we will hear from students of Brookline's Remote Learning Academy. The Remote Learning Academy was established to organize and focus students' remote learning experiences during the COVID shutdown. They will give their reflections on the poem, The Hill Reclimb, that Amanda Gorman read at President Joe Biden's inauguration on January 20th, 2021.
My name is Xavier, and I drew this picture. The nature is taking people alive, and people are being nice to everybody, and people are being nice to them. And I drew some flowers and the grass and the dirt and the sun and people and a tree. And I'm gonna add some more decorations today and tomorrow.
Hello, my name is Shrishti, and I'm gonna read to you one of the poems I wrote. Let the light come true. Sometimes you are different, and it's okay to be you. No need to act like someone else. You can just be you. Let the light come true. Sometimes it might be dark and scary, but you can find the light inside you. Just step up and see the light. And you will realize there is nothing to be afraid of. Sometimes it might take time, and that's okay too. It's okay, it's okay. You can find the light inside you. Let the light take height in the night and make it bright. Let the light come true.
Hi, I'm Sarah Barshak, and this is my interpretation of Section B of Amanda Gorman's speech, The Hill We Climb. This piece is all about setting aside what does not and should not matter to take responsibility for what does matter. We must stand up to what happens that is wrong instead of letting it sit behind us, because if we leave injustices lying around and ignore them, they will only come back to get us later. When we think we have everything fixed, we will just get hit harder yet. If we think of those who do the injustices, those who have different views of the world than I do, than I was taught to have, will keep coming back. They will keep coming back until we tell them that they are not welcome. Thinking of doing something does not help unless you project your idea and do it or make it happen. We will be brave for one another when it counts, and we have to live in the moment to make that happen and to help our future. The moment we give in to the injustices is the moment that we have given up. I was really amazed by the poem when I heard it at the inauguration. But when I read the excerpts A, B, C, and D, I saw the poem in a different way. The first time I heard the poem, I was just mesmerized by what she was able to put together. But when I read over the excerpts again, it made me dig deeper, and the thoughts and meanings just came to me. I'm still amazed for another reason. That reason being that by reading something over and over again gave me a new feeling. I wonder how reading it again gives me new insights. Is it because every time you see something, you notice something that you did not see the time before? Is it because new ideas are always coming and you want to shape what you hear and see to what is already in your mind? I do not know what it is, but I do know that writing this response came easily after I read the excerpts a bunch of times.
Hello, my name is Izzy Park, and I'm in 7th grade at the Florida Ruffin Whitney School. I'm going to read you my reflection of Amanda Gorman's inauguration poem, The Hill We Climbed, that I wrote for the 2020 Run Remote Learning Academy Martin Luther King Writing Celebration. Amanda Gorman reminds us not to look at our differences as obstacles, but as a bridge. And this is just the beginning of making a change. Being different is also being unique. If we use violence to solve anything, that really isn't solving anything. We might think that violence is the only way, but what violence really does is just create more problems. Making a change shouldn't start with hurting someone. Some people use racism as an excuse to hurt people, and if we want to make a change, we must show them that that is wrong. When it says we must put our differences aside, it's important to know that we don't want our differences to hurt people. There have been too many cases of this. When it says we are striving to forge our union with purpose, in my opinion, this means that if we're trying to make a difference and include people with all different cultures, races, and genders, we have to actually value them and make them seem important by listening to them instead of shutting them out. When she says we seek harm to none and harmony for all, that means we are not trying to avoid anyone because of their race, gender, or culture, but include them and not harm one but none.
My name is Janan Wang, and here is my essay. Amanda Gorman highlighted commitment to growth and acceptance in Excerpt B. Growing up Taiwanese in America, it was difficult for me to love and accept both the culture inside and outside my home. Solely speaking Mandarin at home meant that I learned all of my English at school from teachers and friends. The differences between Mandarin and English are significant. The mere 26 letters that make up the English language captures little of the complexities that the 37 principal characters of Mandarin convey, meaning learning one alphabet helps little when learning the other. Oftentimes, I couldn't understand an English word and would get lost in the conversation, feeling helpless and excluded. The language divide felt out of my control. In 2nd grade, my friend was obsessed with the word determined, but I never understood what she meant. Every time the word came up, which is often, I'd get the familiar feeling of dread. After 2 years of struggling to understand what she meant and hearing it repeatedly, it clicked. With my friends, teachers, and everyone around me being supportive instead of judgmental, I had begun to close the divide between our understandings. Living in an environment where the community works to put our differences aside, I have been able to accept and embrace my identity as a Taiwanese woman. Knowing I will not be judged on the things I can't change allows me to ultimately feel in control. I can be proud of my race, my language, and my culture. Thank you.
Next, we will hear from Rabbi Bill Hamilton, who will tell us of Martin Luther King Jr.'s visit to Congregation Kehil If Israel here in Brookline in March of 1966, and King's relationship to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a leading Jewish theologian and philosopher.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rabbi Bill Hamilton of Congregation Kehil If Israel here in Brookline. It's an honor to present to you today this annual MLK event. Sorry I can't be with you in person, as we're all staying hopefully safe and being careful and kind as neighbors throughout our greater Brookline community. It is important to note that in 1966, Kehil If Israel hosted a historic and memorable address from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And I have pictures of the address that took place on March 20th, 1966. Here we have a picture of Reverend King receiving the Brotherhood's Man of the Year Award. And below is an insert picture of him doing a nationally broadcast radio interview in which he addressed the question of the relationship between Jewish landlords and some of the housing practices that were pervasive and punitive at the time against the people of color, and a very, very important interview in which he clarified the problem with landlords, and not specifically Jewish landlords, as a matter of clarity. This remarkable event in 1966 at Kehil If Israel was a high mark in our congregation's history. It also so happens that the very same year, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a very important theological partner with Reverend King, also spoke at the congregation. And that was in honor of the Golden Jubilee of the congregation. And here we have a picture of Rabbi Heschel and his address to the congregation. Some of you know that Reverend King and Rabbi Heschel marched together in Selma, Alabama, did tremendous work together in the name of the prophets of the Bible, and to some extent were themselves prophetic figures of their time. My prayer for us as we take pride as a Brookline community that we were able to host not only Rabbi Heschel, a giant of theological import in his own right, but of course, the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. here in Brookline at Kehil If Israel. I think we're one of the very few faith communities in the world that hosted both of them in the same year, in 1966, for major addresses. May we as a community find in their prophetic messages, and particularly Reverend King's important influence on our country, a prophetic voice that lifts us through these challenging times as the pandemic continues. And may the warmth of that message and the soaring inspiration as Dr. King could uniquely bring it, not just here in Brookline, but indeed throughout our country and throughout the world, may the prophetic power of that message speak to our hearts today for a better tomorrow. God bless.
Next will be poetry readings by Brookline's Poet Laureate, Jennifer Barber, and performance artist, author, and poet, Reggie Gibson. Jennifer Barber will read a poem by civil rights activist Bruce Hartford titled Mississippi Voting Rally that memorializes the violent attack by Mississippi state troopers against a voter registration rally in Grenada, Mississippi. But more importantly, it memorializes the perseverance of the organizers and the community in the face of that violence, who steeled themselves with inner resolve to continue and intensify the struggle. This poem is part of the Civil Rights Movement archives that collects recollections of organizers of civil rights campaigns and makes them available to the public. You can visit the Civil Rights Movement Archive by going to crmvet.org. The poem is subject to copyright by Bruce Hartford, but is available to nonprofit and educational entities, provided we credit the author and the website.
Hi, I'm Jenny Barber, and I'm Brookline's current Poet Laureate. I want to thank the Brookline Commission for the Arts for the Poet Laureate program. And I also want to thank Bernard Greene for including poetry in the MLK program. I'll read a poem today by the civil rights movement activist Bruce Hartford. When Bernard first showed me Hartford's poem from 1966 called Mississippi Voter Rally, I was not familiar with Hartford's life or his writing. As I read up on him, I learned that Bruce Hartford traveled to Grenada, Mississippi as a civil rights worker and was based there during the summer and fall of 1966. He took part in the movement's efforts to register Black voters through the holding of meetings, marches, and registration drives. Poetry and song were a part of the movement, recording both the reality on the ground and aspirations for social justice. Before I share Hartford's poem, I'd like to read a few entries from his prose account of that time, called Grenada, Mississippi, Chronology of a Movement. They provide glimpses into the efforts of many to effect change under difficult, sometimes violent circumstances. June 14th. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Meredith, Mississippi March Against Fear comes striding down Highway 51 into Grenada. July 7th. At a mass meeting in Vincent Chapel, it is decided to stage a protest march that evening. The march is broken up by the police and 43 are arrested for violation of a parade ordinance. July 15th, another afternoon march by about 250 folk on a blazing hot day. Later, a number of students go out to integrate the swimming beach at the lake. While they are at the lake, there is a meeting of the Negro business and professional people. They pledge their support to the movement. That night, we hold our first successful night march. We know that night marches are dangerous because racists can attack under cover of darkness, but more people can participate because it's after working hours. We start with 250 from Bellflower Church, go up around the courthouse, and then over to Union Street. By the time we get back to the church, there are more than 600 people on the march. July 22nd, federal judge Claude Clayton issues a sweeping injunction ordering police to stop interfering with lawful protest and to protect our demonstrations. July 23rd, the white community reacts in fury to the injunction. A large mob of angry whites, estimated at around 700, and reportedly including 5 carloads of Klansmen from Philadelphia, Mississippi, gather on the square to attack the night march. They are visibly armed with clubs, chains, and knives. We assume they also have hidden guns. The Mississippi State Troopers claim to be, quote, caught by surprise by this, quote, sudden hostile mob. They claim they don't have enough men to protect the march. August 8th. A night voter rally is held in front of the registrar's new offices. The police order us to clear the streets. We do, but continue the rally on the sidewalk and yard. The police attack with tear gas and beat people with their billy clubs. About 20 people are injured. So these brief excerpts from Bruce Hartford's account give some background to his poem called Mississippi Voter Rally, in which he describes the events of the night of August 8th. Hot, drippy evening, red and yellow bars of neon light. A crowd of dark shadows defiantly stand in the Mississippi night. Car roof buckles under the weight of silhouetted shadows against the neon. Courage and song rise up from the surrounding sea of unseen folk, engulfing us like a warm, friendly ocean. Helmets advance out of the dark, fearsome, their long, false faces, hideous masks of death. A shouted command, choking fumes, explosions, screams, terror, can't breathe, can't see. The warm ocean scatters like spilled quicksilver, blindly running, blindly escaping. Clubs thud against fragile flesh as helmets leap out of the night, out of the agonizing, blinding fog to fall on helpless innocence. Quite, echoing quite, the damp Mississippi night closes in on homes strangely dark. Black shadows peer from dark windows as the Marsmen patrol their temporarily conquered territory, boots echoing off stony-faced homes. Inside, in the dark, human blast furnaces forge inner resolve. Hammers of anger pounding out determination. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow.
Thank you, Poet Laureate Barber. Next, get ready for Reggie Gibson, who will present an original poem in 3 stanzas titled Assume the Position, which uses an historical analogy to a current reality to warn us not to take lightly the threats facing freedom and democracy today. Please listen closely and actively and see what lessons you can find in this poem, or how it can challenge or not the comfortable ways you may understand the human rights struggle.
Happy New Year to everyone there in Brookline. This is Reggie Gibson. It is indeed good to be back with you this year, albeit digitally, to observe the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I say the legacy, as this denotes there is something that was left behind for us to do. And of course, we know that it was. And Dr. King also was bequeathed a legacy as well, one that was left to him from Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Mariah Stewart, and also people like William Cooper Nell, and any number of courageous individuals who put themselves on the line in order to bring about the promises of democracy and the perfecting of our union. In thinking about what I wanted to offer on this day, so many thoughts ran through my brain. One of them was the issues confronted by the movement for Black Lives. And I have a piece that I had written to deal with that and other things, and it is called Assume the Position, and it is in 3 stanzas. The first stanza is a look at one of the movement for Black Lives perennial issues and how the reality of the uncomfortable truth expressed is at play in determining the fate of too many of our country's citizens. Hands up, legs spread. Did you hear what I just said? Don't move a muscle, boy, or for sure you're gonna end up dead. Put your hands on the steering wheel where I can see them. 1 at 10, 1 at 2. Don't give me any lip, don't give me any look, don't give me any excuse to shoot. Not like I need one, 'cause, son, you and I, we both know the truth that the average white American out here doesn't really give a damn what I do, as long as they can convince themselves someone looking like me in blue is doing his best to protect them from somebody who's looking like you. Assume the position. This stanza, written from the perspective of someone authorized to administer state-sanctioned violence, speaks to a mindset that is extant in our country. In the family in which I have married into, I have had to confront my father-in-law about some of his attitudes that help contribute to this reality. A reality that he has never and most likely will never have to experience, but one that his unexpectedly black grandchildren most likely will. The next stanza that I am going to read from is going to connect that reality that I just spoke of with the reality and the history of the rise of fascism. It may seem at first like there's a stretch, but if you listen, you'll see that not really by much. Hands up, legs spread, has historically been said to entire nations that have ever let the sickness of fascism spread, like some kind of virus growing inside its entire body politic. And it's no coincidence it typically begins with ranting racist rhetoric, and then progresses to the mistreatment of certain minorities and immigrants, which then plays to the prejudices hidden in the mind of a preponderance of its citizens. Then dark history begins again, and them that say it cannot happen here always seem to be surprised when how quickly they rise to assume the position. I don't know about you, but the Capitol riots of last January, sparked by a lying leader and an angry party attempting to stop a lawful process, well, it put me in the mind of something that was eerily analogous to the beer hall putsch, which took place in Munich in Germany, pre-Nazi Germany, the Weimar Republic in 1923. That's when members of the rising Nazi Party were killed, along with 4 police officers, as they took over the city and again attempted to stop a lawful democratic process. You would have thought that that circumstance would have been enough to make a great nation reconsider its path. But of course, 15 years later, there was Kristallnacht. And after that, the threatening of civil rights, then human rights, and then the revocation of another's humanity. And yes, there were those who sounded the alarm as to what was on the horizon, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others. And there were those who said, no, that cannot happen here. One wonders if those citizens that believe this believe so because what was happening was not happening to them. When will we learn that denying others human rights is only going to put our own in the rifle sights? The very notion of American liberty is only guaranteed if it's enforced equally. But to do this is going to take a civic soul acting civilly and fighting to keep our country from giving in to its impulse toward tyranny. But if we find we don't have that kind of commitment, then we'd all better get ready to assume the position. We see this happening in our country so many ways. One of the things which is really getting to me is how it's happening in voting rights. And this is something that we can stop. And I believe that though this picture I've painted through my words pretend a continuation of dark times in our country, I have hope and believe that it doesn't have to be that way. King showed us that when we work, fight, organize, and risk for that more perfect union continuously, and not just on days like this dedicated to those who did so, we can turn back the rising tide that threatens to overwhelm our democracy. Will we? I hope we will. Thank you for listening, and I hope to be and build with you all very soon.
This afternoon, we are very honored to have as our keynote speaker, Boston University law professor, Robert Tsai, speaking on voting rights. Following Professor Tsai, U.S. Representative Jake Auchincloss will update us on developments in Congress around protecting the right to vote. Professor Tsai is a graduate of UCLA and Yale Law School. He speaks widely on constitutional law topics, including voting rights, and teaches courses at BU's law school on constitutional law, presidential leadership, and individual rights. In addition to his many articles and media opinion pieces, Professor Tsai is the author of 3 books: Practical Equality, Forging Justice in a Divided Nation, America's Forgotten Constitutions, Defiant Visions of Power and Community, and Eloquence and Reason, Creating a First Amendment Culture. Professor Tsai's talk will challenge you to reflect upon the complexities of the struggle for voting rights, which includes the intersection of law and many of the social issues we struggle with today, even in Brookline. Issues such as race and the criminal justice system, social problems such as homelessness and the growing gaps between rich and poor, and ancillary but important spin-offs of voting, such as civic responsibilities and engagement. Professor Tsai will speak on the topic, Our Voting Rights, the Struggle Continues. Voting rights was always central to Martin Luther King's organizing. As Professor Tsai will describe and analyze in his talk, King viewed the vote as power. In his Give Us the Ballot speech in 1957 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and I'm paraphrasing, he said that with the ballot, there would be no need to plead for civil rights. Rather, with the ballot, Negroes would have the power to ensure those rights themselves. Please don't listen to Professor Tsai's talk passively from a position outside of our current reality and the events in today's world and your understanding of those events. Be open to the possibility that Professor Tsai's talk sharpens your understanding or revises your opinions concerning that current reality.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm honored to be your Martin Luther King Day speaker. The theme for this year's celebration is Our Voting Rights, the Struggle Continues. I'd like to first spend a few moments speaking with you about what it means to leave behind a civic legacy. I'll talk a little bit about Dr. King's struggle to ensure that all Americans can enjoy the right to vote. After that, I'll turn to the subject of what it means for each of you, each of us, to continue Dr. King's struggle. And I'll invite you at the end to leave behind a voting rights legacy of your own. A legacy is something you leave behind. Within a family, it is something transmitted from an ancestor to a descendant, from a mother or father to a child. Typically, that something involves property or money, something valuable. But a legacy can also be political or legal in nature, which makes it no less tangible. A legacy can be a hard-won set of ideas and achievements that can be distilled into lessons for the next generation to heed if they care about happiness and prosperity. This is the sense in which I want to talk to you about Dr. King's legacy when it comes to voting rights, as a set of ideas that he developed through political struggle that we can mine for civic lessons. Most people remember Dr. King for his philosophy of nonviolence to promote social change, or for his I Have a Dream speech on the Mall in 1963, demanding civil rights and presenting a multiracial vision of a just society. Taking to the streets of Birmingham, or gathering in Montgomery, or filling the steps of the Lincoln Memorial all certainly represent key moments in this struggle for dignity and equality in America. But for King, marching and gathering out of doors was always a tactic of desperation to be used because the political system was no longer functioning as a result of racism, imperialism, and excessive capitalism. Hitting the streets was not an end to itself. Instead, restoring access to the vote and rallying people to register to vote were the immediate objectives. Why, you might ask? Well, these mechanisms, the right to vote, not only represented the hallmarks of civic equality, but they always were indispensable to how to create a just society. In other words, King's ultimate objectives encompassed making America a true democracy, run according to the common good, rather than a disfigured republic run by selfish elites. In 1957, standing for the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. King decried what he called, quote, all types of conniving methods that were being used to prevent Black Americans from becoming registered voters. Such tactics, he said, amounted to, quote, a tragic betrayal of our democratic traditions, and they represented democracy turned upside down. In this speech, King linked unfair and unequal control of the franchise to individual autonomy. This is what he said. Quote, so long as I do not firmly and irrevocably possess the right to vote, I do not possess myself. I cannot make up my mind. It is made up for me. What he was saying was that without sovereignty, then individuals were objects, not democratic subjects. Under such conditions, King said, I cannot live as a democratic citizen. I can only submit to the edict of others. After a 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, Reverend King addressed the gathered crowd at the state capitol on March 25, 1965. He described the democratic spirit expressed through passage of laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. For King, just and effective laws, indeed the rule of law itself, represented the solution to terror and brutality. But he also said that ending discrimination in employment and in public accommodations was not enough. Without the vote, Dr. King said, the law offered only, quote, dignity without strength. What he meant by strength, of course, is political power, meaningful influence, the capacity to improve the lives of yourselves and your neighbors, the ability to stop injustices in their tracks, and to reduce inequality in America. Now, Dr. King understood what others have also observed, that the right to vote is like the one ring to bind them all. Whoever enjoys the right to vote and exercises that right intelligently and regularly possesses the power to control all other rights. Conversely, a community that lacks the right to vote or does not exercise it intelligently and regularly would be incapable of protecting other rights. Give us the ballot, King implored, and we will, by the force of our vote, write the law on the statute books. Give us the ballot and we will transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill. Give us the ballot and we will place judges on the benches who do justly and love mercy, he said. Our whole campaign in Alabama has been centered around the right to vote, Dr. King told the crowd. For the goal was to expose the historical connection between the vote and racial segregation. For convincing white voters to commit to racial segregation and to enact discriminatory laws was coupled with disfranchising black voters in many of these states. What King said was that the threat of the free exercise of the ballot by the Negro and the white masses alike resulted in the establishment of a segregated society. So it was through manipulation of the ballot and the exclusion of black voters from democratic participation that prevented citizens of all races from uniting and building a great society, a community where none would prey on the weakness of others. You can also detect Dr. King's emphasis on the right to vote at other key moments in history. For instance, on June 19, 1965, the Voting Rights Bill had passed the Senate but was being blocked in the House Rules Committee. Dr. King authored an op-ed describing the right to vote as fundamental. Quote, "To deny a person the right to exercise his political freedom at the polls is no less a dastardly act as to deny a Christian the right to petition God in prayer," he wrote. This is how strongly Dr. King felt about the vote. Blocking the right to vote was an affront to God himself. And as before, he reminded his audience that day that disfranchisement, quote, "is the main instrument for perpetuating injustices of all kinds, and not just racial inequality." For this reason, his message to us was that we should all pay close attention to how voting rules are created, how they operate in practice, and how they are being changed. What is the reason for a particular rule? Does it make voting easier, or does it make it harder for the average person? What about the rule's effects on young people, the elderly, the poor, racial and ethnic minorities? But there's another lesson to be learned about Dr. King's legacy besides the importance of protecting access to the ballot. He also left us a vision about what it means to exercise the right to vote wisely. The ultimate goals, he said, were substantive justice, not just fair treatment of individuals regardless of race or creed, but relief from material suffering. In May of 1966, for instance, Reverend King spoke in Kingstree, South Carolina. He was there to drive up turnout in the upcoming election to choose a new U.S. Senator. He urged listeners to cast ballots so that people will have, quote, "food and material necessities for their bodies, freedom and dignity for their spirits, and education and culture for their minds. Let us march on ballot boxes so that men and women will no longer walk the streets in search of jobs that do not exist, and to march on ballot boxes until the empty stomachs of fellow citizens are filled," he said. Let me now turn to some contemporary lessons. We just had the one-year anniversary of January 6th, a horrific effort by a handful of insiders, militia groups, and supporters of a president to help him hold on to power, despite the fact that he lost the popular vote by 7 million votes cast and the Electoral College 306 to 232. If that plot to delay the receipt of the Electoral College votes had worked, or if Vice President Mike Pence had refused to accept the votes from a handful of states, we would have experienced a major constitutional crisis in this country. And as it was, we had a president and close aides who refused to accept the results of a democratic election, who sowed doubts about the integrity of the results and who desperately tried to hold on to power by leaning on state election officials and legislators. This is the kind of thing we often see in other less stable countries. But we should realize by now that America is no longer special in that regard. More than ever, we are vulnerable to the same kind of internal disruptions and democratic backsliding that we often criticize in other nations. If we are to play our part in the continuing struggle to ensure that our voting rights remain available to all, we will have to pay close attention to what's happening in our neighborhoods, but we'll also have to pay close attention to what's happening in other neighborhoods. For in the wake of the 2020 election, a number of states have enacted new rules that make it harder to get on voting rolls, harder to get a ballot, harder to cast a vote, and easier for state or local officials to subvert the will of voters if partisans don't like the outcome. The 2020 election actually set a record for the highest turnout in the past century, with 66% of eligible voters casting a ballot. But for some people, 6 out of every 10 people voting is still too many. In Georgia, the GOP-dominated legislature, shocked by the election of 2 Democrats to the U.S. Senate, vowed to prevent this from happening ever again. Not only have they changed voting rules in the state, they have also reorganized local election boards, making it easier to engage in partisan power plays and voter dilution. The reason that is often given to justify these changes we're seeing across the country is fear of voter fraud. But audit after audit, investigation after investigation has revealed little in the way of actual fraud. The tiny number of individuals caught breaking the law usually run afoul of complicated rules that they don't understand, and these individuals aren't part of some vast conspiracy. Beyond the raft of election rules being altered in advance of the upcoming midterm elections, there are the everyday laws that already make it hard to vote. It's almost quaint to learn that in one sense, overall turnout, democracy actually had its heyday in the United States in the late 19th century. Then, during several national election cycles, turnout approached or exceeded 80% of eligible voters. And for a brief moment after Reconstruction, when black citizens were permitted to vote across the country for the first time legally, they not only turned out in high numbers, but voters elected black legislators in significant numbers, in numbers that we've never seen again. But then, in a number of states, particularly those with a diverse electorate, elites convinced voters that it was worth imposing voting restrictions even if that depressed turnout. People were willing to exclude even poor white voters if many immigrants and newly emancipated slaves would be barred from voting. Complicated voter registration rules were created for the first time, followed by literacy tests, poll taxes, white primaries, felon disenfranchisement laws, and gerrymandering. Now, I've had the great fortune of living in several states in this country. Some states are like Oregon and the District of Columbia, places where the community trusts the people and make it easy to vote. I've also lived in places like Georgia, where those in charge sometimes fear, without proof, fraud and criminality lurking around every ballot box. In Oregon, the state mails every person a ballot, no questions asked, and you can sit around the kitchen table, as my family once did, discussing the issues and candidates and marking the ballots. On the other hand, when I lived in Atlanta, I had to worry constantly about long lines at precincts and missing a significant amount of work. Today in Massachusetts, the state disfranchises citizens who commit a single felony. In 2020, over 5 million Americans across the country could not vote because of prior conviction. This number is 5 times higher than it was in 1975. The number of citizens who have been stripped of their right to vote has climbed, in the age of mass incarceration, just as America has become the world's leader in the number of individuals imprisoned per capita. These laws seem race neutral, but they originated at a time when legislatures sought ingenious methods to reduce the number of eligible black voters. And this worked. States like Virginia followed the example of Alabama and Louisiana because those states' experiments showed that using certain crimes as a proxy for race could effectively eliminate undesirable people from the voting population. In Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia today, 1 in 5 black citizens is stripped of the right to vote. And because wealthy and mostly white voters vote regularly, getting rid of 7%, 10%, or even 20% of voters of color will give the people who are most well off in society outsized power to dictate policies. The practice of disfranchising someone who commits a crime, of course, is an ancient one, whereby a person is punished through what's called civil death. But the time, it seems, has come to ask ourselves whether this is a practice that is still consistent with a modern democracy. Practices that strip individuals of their basic rights not only punish people out of all proportion to the mistakes they make, they also make it harder to reintegrate into society once someone has done their time. Why work hard to get a job when you get out of prison or jail and make amends if the state wants to write you off as a citizen, unworthy of equality or influence? As Massachusetts voters, you can work to end felon disfranchisement in this state and return to an older and lengthy history of allowing incarcerated people to vote. In fact, for much of this state's history, a resident would lose the right to vote only for one reason: committing voter fraud. Incarcerated people have long been permitted to vote in this state, and many have. And those who did so retained ties to their community and continue to care about the world outside of prison walls. Efforts to disfranchise Massachusetts residents in prison did not even make headway until the late 1990s, deep into the war on crime era. In 2000, voters in this state amended the state constitution to ban people who commit a felony from voting, with the exception of presidential and municipal elections. A year later, in 2001, the legislature closed those loopholes, making civil death a reality in this state. This is unfortunate and certainly incompatible with King's vision. For in a society that sees crime everywhere, we will see criminals everywhere. Such a society will pass more and more criminal laws and throw the book at people who commit even minor offenses. And when you add vote stripping into the calculus, aggressive enforcement of a plethora of laws will then mean that many loved ones and neighbors will be stripped of their rights, along with their dignity. Today, some 8,200 Massachusetts citizens are barred from voting. And as expected, the ban falls heavily on people of color in this state. While 18% of residents of Massachusetts are people of color, 58% of those who have lost their vote are people of color. If Massachusetts were to reverse its laws and constitutional amendments on this issue, the state could join Vermont and Maine as the leaders on this issue, and once again freely allow incarcerated people to vote. You might ask yourself, would changing the laws matter to the outcome of any elections, even though the number of disfranchised voters in this state is relatively small? Well, in close elections, even small differences in eligibility or turnout can make all the difference in the world. Consider the 2000 presidential election, in which the Supreme Court of the United States halted the Florida recount, with George Bush ahead of Al Gore by 538 votes, thereby throwing the office to Bush. At the time, the media made much of the infamous butterfly ballots, the hanging chads, the standards by which legal votes were determined. But few people remembered that felon disfranchisement in Florida also may have played a role in that close election. At the time, Florida barred anyone convicted of a felony anywhere from voting. Historically, Florida has been one of the worst states in this regard, not only disfranchising people who commit a felony, but also doing so permanently for the rest of their lives. And if you lived in Florida, unlike Massachusetts, you had to petition for your vote back once released, and state officials rarely gave you your vote back. Until recently, some 1.4 million Florida citizens could not vote due to a prior conviction. Now, right before the 2000 election, the Secretary of State purged 58,000 people from the voter rolls for this reason alone, citing Florida's ban on felons voting. State officials did very little to verify that people removed from the rolls were actually felons. And this action fell heavily on black voters. While black voters made up 11% of registered voters in Florida, they represented 44% of voters purged from the rolls. A lawsuit filed by the NAACP after the election led to a closer look at what happened. And a study showed that some 12,000 people purged from the rolls should not have been labeled felons. Many errors were made, from confusing people with similar names to failing to update information about a person's criminal record. So, who knows how much history might have changed if just a fraction of those purged had been able to vote in the 2000 presidential election. So, what's to be done? If we are to remain a democracy and a beacon for other people, we're going to need your help. Collective action is the only solution to counteract the instinct that we are seeing and the potent political movement that we are seeing that wants to turn our voting rights into a privilege available only to those who look the right way, who act the right way, who express the right ideas. An excellent example of the need to continue the struggle for equality through constant civic engagement can be found in the area of criminal justice. Many people think that passing better laws is enough, but laws aren't machines that run themselves. People enforce laws, and we need good people to show up to help enforce them. Principles can be frustrated when enforcement doesn't happen the best way that it could. One of the predicaments that I see in my research is the problem of unrepresentative juries. Sometimes unequal laws are the problem in creating unrepresentative juries, but even where the laws are fine as written, injustice can come from juries that make decisions when those juries don't reflect the diversity of a community. When people don't answer jury summonses or fail to show up for jury duty, then people end up being tried by less diverse juries that tend to be less forgiving. We're also going to need your help on voting rights because times have changed, and that means institutions have also changed. Once, judges and presidents could be trusted to care about voting rights across the country, and once they had the tools to do so. But these days, a commitment to protecting voting rights seems to wax and wane depending on who is in power and whose party benefits. I mentioned earlier Dr. King's efforts in building popular support for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Sadly, after a brief shining moment of vigorous enforcement of that law, the courts can no longer be depended upon to protect voting rights. The U.S. Supreme Court has in recent years gutted the Voting Rights Act's strongest provisions and now allows states, even those with a dark history of voter suppression, to return to their old ways. Now dominated by skeptics of the legacy of Dr. King, the Supreme Court has turned a blind eye to partisan gerrymandering and to the entrenchment of political power by a small number of people. A number of decisions turn their back on the people's struggle for dignity and equality by giving already powerful elites more tools to frustrate the wishes of the majority. One thing we can do is to update federal voting rights laws. President Joe Biden has asked Congress to make this a priority. One such bill, called the Freedom to Vote Act, if it could be enacted, would force states to offer same-day registration and online registration, two things which are shockingly unavailable in a number of states. If passed, the bill would also ensure that people could vote in federal elections even if they once spent time in prison. Early voting would be guaranteed, and absentee voting would become more available, coming closer to what I experienced when I lived in Oregon. There are, of course, obstacles to the passage of voting rights legislation, whether in Congress or in this state. Even so, it's good to remember that when people get together in a democracy, we can do incredible things that once seemed unimaginable. I'll leave you with this inspiration. One of the greatest acts of people power took place in Florida in November 2018, when citizens of that state approved an initiative to rewrite the state constitution. By a whopping 2/3 support of the electorate, voters re-enfranchised 1.4 million people. The state legislature, which opposed the measure, responded by writing a law that said individuals cannot regain the right to vote until all court fines and fees are paid off. Unfortunately, some 700,000 people remain unable to vote because they are too poor to pay off these court fees. So the struggle over the vote continues. Ask yourself today, what's your civic legacy going to be? I hope it will be to not only exercise your hard-won right to vote in the next election, but also that it's to join the effort of others in this community and in other communities to protect the fundamental right to vote. If we can make this commitment together, we can truly honor Dr. King's legacy and leave the world a better place for our children and for their children. Thank you, and happy Martin Luther King Day.
Let it resound loud as the rolling sea.
Thank you, Brookline, for including me in your MLK Day ceremonies. Martin Luther King Jr. envisioned a country in which every American was judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And we have much work to do to achieve that ideal. MLK Jr. and his fellow travelers in the civil rights movement, including the late Congressman John Lewis, knew that voting rights in particular were near sacred in their importance to America's civic health. Today, only a few weeks past the one-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection, we know that America's democracy is unhealthy. We also know, though, that there are two bills in particular that can help cure it. One is the Freedom to Vote Act, and the other is the Protecting Our Democracy Act. The Freedom to Vote Act, which is currently in the Senate, would protect state and local election officials from partisan subversion so that they could do their nonpartisan civic job, would expand access to the ballot box by, for example, making early voting and voter registration more easy. They would push out dark money in our elections and end, finally, partisan gerrymandering, amongst a host of critical bipartisan reforms to make sure that our elections are free and fair and immune from partisan subversion. The Protecting Our Democracy Act would restore and strengthen the separations of powers and the checks and balances in Washington, D.C. that our founders so presciently devised. For example, they would better insulate inspectors general within the various administrative departments from presidential interference, and it would allow us to better enforce congressional subpoenas. These two bills reflect not just the learnings of the last 4 years under President Trump, but a wide range of decades-long research about what best makes our democracy function. I am committed to passing these two bills, including by early and vociferously advocating for the abolition of the filibuster. If you feel as passionately as I do about voting rights and protecting our democracy, I encourage you to get involved in two organizations in particular, both of which have roots here in Massachusetts. One is an organization called Protecting Democracy, founded by a range of former Obama White House attorneys. And this launches litigation and advocates for policy that can strengthen the sinews of our civic life. The second is the Environmental Voter Project, which mobilizes voters throughout the country who are pro-climate change voters. This not only helps us take action on climate change, which I know is a critical issue for many of us, but also strengthens our democracy by turning out voters who previously had not voted before. On this Martin Luther King Jr. Day, let us honor the legacy of the great Reverend by finally passing these two bills that are so critical for the health of our democracy.
Brookline Martin Luther King Celebration Committee appreciates the many people and organizations who work together to make this year's virtual event possible. The full list of credits will follow my concluding remarks, but I want to give special recognition to a few people and organizations. Brookline Interactive Group for helping to produce and broadcast today's event, especially invaluable assistance by Ann Thies. Brookline Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, and Assistant Director Caitlin Starr, who always provides invaluable and irreplaceable support to the committee in producing our programs. The Brookline Community Foundation, the Remote Learning Academy Parent-Teacher Organization, and special thanks to everyone who made possible the beautiful and moving poster that we have used to advertise this program. First, the family of John Wilson, who made it possible for us to use the MLK print that you see in our poster. John Wilson's grandchildren attended the Pierce School, where one of the MLK prints is hanging. Martha Richardson, Fine Arts Boston, who gave the committee permission to use the image and represents John Wilson's artistic estate. And finally, Kristen Leader Design, who designed the beautiful poster for the event. The Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Committee produces various events during the year relevant to social justice. Put May 1 on your calendar, when the committee will host a discussion between singer, songwriter, and activist Reggie Harris and Brookline resident Wallace Reamer, titled Family Past and Present, a Story of Hope in Black and White. They will discuss their common ancestor, a Confederate general who enslaved the ancestors of Mr. Harris. The past few years have showed us how important, but how fragile, is our right to vote. It requires that we take responsibility to register to vote and vote despite any obstacles that are thrown in our way or despite the cynicism and hopelessness that may surround us. The past few years have also showed us how fragile our comfort, even in a town like Brookline, may be. So we urge you to support those nonprofit institutions that are providing safety nets to people who suffer from hunger, homelessness, or despair, whether caused by COVID or other causes. I will mention two key organizations that can provide assistance or that need your donations: the Brookline Food Pantry and the Brookline Community Foundation's Safety Net Fund. You can also go to the webpage of the Diversity Office for additional resources if you need services or support.
Hello, everyone. My name is Giselle Farrow-Puigbo, and I'm the Executive Director of the Brookline Community Foundation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share some reflections today. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love." When I reflected on where we see Dr. King's definitions of power and justice manifest in our community, I immediately thought of the day-to-day work of civic and community engagement. Every day in Brookline, we see dedicated community members working to shape our collective future, whether that's through environmental efforts, participating in town government, volunteering, donating, and much more. And more recently, BCF was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to support you in this work through our community listening sessions, where so many thoughtful community members shared insights and played a key role in helping shape how ARPA funding decisions will be made in our town. BCF is grateful that we can play a role today and well into the future in supporting civic and community participation here in Brookline. And we remain deeply committed not only to the day-to-day work of engagement, but to living our values as we move forward together.
As part of its recognition of the important role Martin Luther King Jr. played in opening opportunities for all, the town of Brookline makes available to the public its annual report on the racial and gender composition of its workforce. This report will be available on the webpage of the Diversity Office. Thank you for attending the Town of Brookline's 2022 Martin Luther King Jr. virtual celebration event. Have a joyful, safe, and intellectually stimulating year. Thank you.
Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on.